welcome to this discussion on the Apostle Paul's statement, "We did not teach error." Now, by way of example, you all may remember how in the year 2008, an economic catastrophe of global proportions shook the financial world to its very foundations. Some reporters and analysts went so far even to call it an economic Armageddon. And as a result of it, $13 trillion vanished, vaporized from the face of the earth and from the bank accounts of millions of hardworking, honest individuals, many of whom were pensioners who, after many long years of hard work, were hoping to quietly live out the rest of their lives on the savings they had picked and scraped for so hard for those many years. But along came these geniuses with new rules. The era of economic liberalism had begun. It brought the financial world the policy of laissez-faire, which was masquerading all around the world as some kind of economic enlightenment. And some national governments, particularly of the United States, took that policy way too far when they allowed their banks to take all the traditional and proven conservative financial principles and hurl them overboard. Because the greatest minds on Wall Street had made the stunning announcement that they had mathematically found a way to eliminate financial risk. Oh, the times they were a-changing. It was out with the old rules and in with the new ones. And bankers the world over threw out their moral compass, which would have showed them the error of their ways. Those of you who have studied economics know very well that risk can never be eliminated. It can only be moved from one individual to another. So the liberated investment banker, to whom the poor investor had given their trust, began putting their money into all kinds of high-risk investment tools, abandoning all common sense, which tells us that what goes up can also come down. But the American government decided to believe the experts and threw fiscal conservatism overboard. And from then on, it was bedlam. But the American president of the time, knowing that it would boost his popularity, proudly announced to the nation, "My government is taking actions that will allow every American to own their own home." Sounds great. So in keeping with laissez-faire economics, governments around the world completely unbridled their financial establishments, and even went so far as allowing banks to provide mortgages to people who had no source of income and no jobs, so that they could buy their own home. We've done away with risk, right? Then they went and invented the most bizarre financial tools like synthetic derivatives, credit default swaps, and collateralized debt obligations, CDOs. I don't know what any of those are. And for the first few years, they hit the jackpot, and millions of people jumped on to ride the bull. Hey, we're making insane money here. We're gonna dance till the music stops. And so they began passing those dubious investment tools from one bank to another. And several major foreign banks were duped when they purchased them in the millions of dollars, never suspecting that the bank that had just sold them turned around and made a financial wager on their failure. But then all of a sudden, what went up really did come down. The boomerang of economic and moral liberalization came back and hit them square between the eyes. Of course, you all know the name that was written on that boomerang. And so the fantasy bubble burst in 2007 when house prices in America suddenly went down. It was time to pay the bill. But many of the victimized banks were badly overdrawn and had nothing to pay with. Many very large banks found their coffers empty and had to go out of business. It was economic Armageddon, and many people thought that the world banking system was about to completely collapse. And although things have apparently stabilized with all the government buyouts, the world banking system is still feeling the aftershocks to this day. And who do you think was forced to pay for the implementation of these new rules? You guessed it, the one that everyone had forgotten about. The hard-working taxpayer and his lucky progeny for the next 10,000 years. You see, those governments that took the bait of economic liberalization ended up having to buy out those troubled banks. But as for all those unemployed and low-income mortgage holders, they couldn't afford to pay their mortgages anymore. They lost their dream homes, and all those pensioners, finding themselves stripped of all their savings, had to do something they thought they would never have to do again in their lives. They went out to look for a job again. Financial analysts say that the cause of this cataclysmic financial disaster was the result of too many governments in too many countries liberating their financial institutions from the good old traditional conservative financial rules. Those governments made the mistake of bowing down and worshiping the experts without performing due diligence first. And radical liberalization, with all its brainwashing, lured them into what they believed was a financial paradise. But it was a fool's paradise. And of course you all know that liberalism, with its amorality, has aggressively invaded every part of modern society, including economics, culture, psychology, science, art, and yes, even religion. And the common false doctrine that connects them all is that they encourage the violation of God's moral laws. And while a gentle and humane approach to the world's problems is in many ways a good thing, you find that that's not where it ends. But they've also gone and flooded the civilized world with the delusional doctrine that freedom means the absence of law. Yes, they offer us complete freedom, a utopia or paradise. But beloved, it's a fool's paradise, and it does not last. I've just given you one of the most notorious examples of catastrophic error of doctrine. But many such new doctrines are taking modern Christianity by storm. And if you believe this is not true, then I say to you politely, get your head out of the crack in the wall. Let me make it clear that not all, but way too many of our preachers and theologians are just like those economists, by making the same mistake of leading their unsuspecting followers up the garden path and into an even more dangerous fool's paradise. With their great intellects and astute minds, they have determined that many of the traditional, fundamental biblical teachings are old hat and have no relevance or application to the modern man and woman. And because of this imperfection, they've undertaken the task of developing Christianity further, modifying it to a point where it will agree with the values of modern civilization. They feel that Christ and his apostles presented us with a primitive, overly strict, and therefore unacceptable gospel. However, when we start taking our gospel teachings from these wrong sources, we're committing a fatal error. These days, there are so many sources of information that it's too easy to select a wrong or unreliable source. And if we choose not to do the research for ourselves and think for ourselves, we're handing ourselves over to a disastrous fate, not only in this life, but also in the never-ending life to come. You see, people are so self-seeking that by merely trusting the expert, you are making a huge mistake, and the ramifications will be devastating. Trust us, said the experts, and we'll make you rich. And so millions of people abandoned their healthy skepticism and blindly followed the experts. And also the theologians and evangelists are telling us, trust us, and we'll give you a new and easier gospel for those of you who don't like the first one. But God's word teaches us very clearly that if we want to achieve salvation, we've got to think for ourselves. The responsibility is ours to carefully think it through, and not just rely on some expert who is popular and has his own TV program. You see, having the right kind of faith affects the growth and security of the most important investment you and I will ever make, and that is the eternal security, or the retirement of our souls, if you will. And eternity is not just merely where we're going to spend the next 20 or 30 years of our earthly retirement, but how and where we're going to spend the next 20 or 30 billion years of our lives. You may have heard the Latin expression caveat emptor, buyer beware. This axiom tells us that in the final analysis, the responsibility for product satisfaction lies not with the seller, but the buyer. This means that the law assumes that any rational consumer, as a rule, must take the opportunity to carefully inspect and evaluate a product before buying it. And with that purchase, we declare our satisfaction and trust to the seller. This principle of mandatory product evaluation is also known as the due diligence principle. It states that the onus is on the buyer to perform due diligence, and if he or she dislikes the product after the purchase, the law tells them, don't come to us. You had the opportunity to perform due diligence, and you bought it voluntarily. Caveat emptor. But how does this apply to our salvation? You see, for everyone it is appointed first to die, and then the judgment. And every born-again Christian will still stand before the judgment seat of Christ. But for non-Christians, on that great and terrible day before the judgment throne of God, the vast majority of people will hear God say to them, Sir, Madam, caveat emptor, you were given more than enough time to perform due diligence. Depart from me to where there will be eternal weeping and gnashing of teeth. And those who neglected the due diligence regarding their own souls and went and accepted the wrong gospel, they will be tormented eternally by the thought of what could have been. We must examine our lives. We must examine our faith. We must examine our doctrine. The unexamined life, said Socrates, is not worth living. And we have to always be aware that these thoughts, choices, and actions are very real and have eternal significance. But there are so many of us who refuse to perform that strenuous struggle of thought. Why is it so important for us to think so hard and hold fast to sound doctrine? Isn't the most important thing just to be sincere in what you believe? But with the stakes as high as they are, that is a very nearsighted viewpoint. You see, whichever way your doctrine or your teaching goes, your behavior is sure to follow. You can be sincere and be sincerely wrong. You can be sincerely lost. Evangelist Billy Graham gives this wonderful example to anyone who is counting upon their sincerity alone to be saved. And this incident he describes actually did happen. In 1965, during an NFL football game, the quarterback of one team threw the football to the intended receiver on his own team. You probably all know that in American and Canadian football, the player who catches the ball has to run with it into the end zone of the opposite team. And if he manages to do that successfully without being tackled to the ground, he earns his team a touchdown worth 6 points. So during this football game, the quarterback threw the ball to the intended receiver, but that receiver failed to catch it. He fumbled the ball, and instead a player from the opposite team happened to intercept it. And he began to run like there was no tomorrow into the end zone to score his team a touchdown. He ran the greatest sprint of his life, holding onto the ball with complete confidence and determination, not allowing anyone to tackle him to the ground and take away the football. And so he managed to run all the way into the end zone and scored a 6-point touchdown. And at first glance, everything looked great, except for one detail. He was running in the wrong direction. He was running into his own team's end zone instead of the opposing team's. You see, through all the huge bodies tackling and falling over one another, the player got turned around and disoriented. His mind had tricked him into making a mistake. And that caused him to run into his own team's end zone instead of the opposing one as he should have. And so without realizing it, he scored a touchdown for the opposite team. He ran successfully. He didn't drop the ball. And he was very sincere and even confident that he was running in the right direction. But what a disappointment awaited him when he found out his mistake. Yes, beloved, one can be sincere and lost. We can be thinking all the time that we're on God's side, despite the fact that our words and our actions are in complete contradiction to his will. We will not be saved and secure in Christ on sincerity alone. It's imperative to be sincere and correct, running the race with sound biblical doctrine and teaching. How often we see evangelists boasting about how many thousands of sincere people have come to Christ through their ministry. And yet in reality, they've only succeeded in fooling the people into accepting a completely false Christ. A Christ that has been fabricated in their own imaginations, and not at all the Jesus of the Bible, the real Jesus. What a shame that so much work and trouble has been wasted.